Imagine this. You've lived in a country for over 30 years. It's your home. Then, in the middle of a freezing winter night, you're forced onto a ship and sent away to a place you barely even know. This isn't some old dusty story. It's a forgotten chapter of American history. This is the story of the Red Ark, a moment when the ideals of America crashed head-on with a massive wave of fear. You know who said that? Emma Goldman. She was a famous anarchist, an activist, and she had lived in the United States for 34 years. And on that freezing night in 1919, from the porthole of the ship that was exiling her, she saw the Statue of Liberty. Can you even imagine the irony? She was just one of hundreds of people who got caught up in what we now call America's first Red Scare. The ship's official name was the USAT Buford, but everyone in the press was calling it the Red Ark. And on board were 249 people who weren't U.S. citizens, people like activists, labor organizers, and some who were just swept up because of their political beliefs. They were deported, just like that. No trial, their entire lives turned upside down, all in the name of national security. So that's the big question, right? How does a country that's built on ideas of free speech and being a refuge for immigrants get to a point where it's literally shipping people out for their ideas? Well, to understand the Red Ark, you have to understand the intense pressure cooker atmosphere of America right after World War I. See, the years after the war were anything but peaceful back home. The country was completely on edge, caught in what was basically a perfect storm of paranoia and, well, outright hysteria. And the fear just built up so fast. In 1917, you have the US getting into the war, and at the same time, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia kicks off this global fear of communism. Then 1919 happens, and things just escalate like crazy. A huge general strike in Seattle shuts down the entire city. A few months later, somebody mails dozens of bombs to prominent officials. And then in June, a wave of bombings hits 8 different cities, and one of them actually damages the home of the U.S. Attorney General. To a lot of people, it really felt like the country was under attack from the inside. And listen, this fear wasn't just on the streets. It went all the way to the top. President Woodrow Wilson himself said that these creatures of anarchy must be crushed out. That kind of language from the president basically set the stage for the government to take some really drastic action. The only question was, did they have the legal power to do it? To turn all of that anxiety into actual legal power, the government didn't look to criminal courts. No, they looked at immigration law. A place where the rules, as it turns out, were very, very different. So the government essentially armed itself with some new legal weapons. First up was the Espionage Act of 1917, which really cracked down on anti-war speech. But the real game changer was the Immigration Act of 1918. This thing specifically allowed the government to deport non-citizens just for being members of anarchist groups. And this is so important, it also got rid of a key protection that used to stop the deportation of people who had lived in the U.S. for more than 5 years. And just look at how incredibly broad the definition of anarchist was in this law. It wasn't about catching somebody in the act of doing something violent. You could be deported for what you believed, for something you wrote, or even just for being affiliated with a group that held certain views. It was a net designed to catch people for their thoughts and their connections, not necessarily for their actions. Okay, so the core legal idea that made all of this possible rested on this one crucial distinction. The Supreme Court had already decided that deportation wasn't a criminal punishment. They said it was an administrative procedure. And what that meant was that for non-citizens in immigration cases, constitutional rights like the First Amendment and due process, well, they just didn't apply in the same way. It created 2 totally different sets of rules. So you've got this climate of absolute fear. You have these powerful new legal weapons. The stage was set. All you needed were the people to actually launch the crackdown, and they were ready. The whole operation was led by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. And remember, his own house had been bombed, so for him, this was personal. And his right-hand man was this incredibly ambitious 24-year-old named J. Edgar Hoover, who was put in charge of a brand new intelligence division just to track down radicals. So over just a few months in late 1919 and early 1920, Palmer and Hoover unleashed these massive raids all across the country. And the scale of it was just staggering. They often didn't even bother with warrants. Federal agents just rounded up as many as 10,000 people. The tactics they used were brutal, and they were totally indiscriminate. Agents would just storm into the meeting halls of groups they were targeting, like the Union of Russian Workers, and they'd arrest everybody inside. Not just the members, but visitors, people passing by, even people who were just teaching English classes in the same building. And many of these people were held for weeks in these awful, overcrowded jails with no access to a lawyer. So out of those thousands upon thousands of people who were arrested and held, in the end, a total of 556 were actually deported because of the Palmer raids. And that number includes the 249 people who were sent away on the Red Ark. But here's the kicker. The whole point of this massive nationwide hunt was to find violent revolutionaries, right? Well, after arresting 10,000 people, do you know what they found? The raids turned up a grand total of just 4 pistols. That's it, 4. The sheer scale and, frankly, the brutality of these raids were so extreme that they started a huge backlash. And it wasn't coming from radicals. It was coming from inside the government itself. It became a real crisis of conscience for the country. And this is where a very unlikely hero enters the story, a guy named Louis Freeland Post. As the Assistant Secretary of Labor, he was the person who had the final say, the final signature on deportation warrants. And he was absolutely horrified by what the Department of Justice was doing. So Post starts meticulously going over every single case that J. Edgar Hoover sends to his desk. And he realizes thousands of them are just completely illegal. They're based on flimsy evidence or clear violations of the rules. So single-handedly, he invalidated more than 2,000 of those arrest warrants. And in doing so, he saved thousands of people from being deported. And then the court started to push back too. In this really important ruling, a federal judge named George W. Anderson just completely condemned what the Justice Department was doing with this incredible line. I mean, think about that. He's a federal judge, and he's basically calling the government's agents a mob. His decision really helped bring the whole era of the raids to an end. The fallout from all this was huge. The raids were exposed as this massive government overreach. A. Mitchell Palmer, who thought he was going to run for president, saw his political career completely destroyed. The brand new American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, published a huge report detailing all the government's illegal tactics. And in a really poignant final twist, Emma Goldman's body was actually allowed to return to the U.S. for burial in 1940. The country that kicked her out in life welcomed her back in death. You know, the story of the Red Ark is over a century old, but it leaves us with a question that feels as urgent today as it was back then. The combination of public fear and new legal tools created a kind of playbook that we've seen echoes of ever since, from the McCarthy era in the 50s to the security debates after 9/11. When a crisis hits, how does a nation protect itself without giving up the very freedoms that define it? It's a question America is still trying to answer.